Thank you all. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Jessica, no longer with us. And thank you, Ben McFall. Ben has been here since 1978. And since I've been coming to this store since 1970, I started consulting with him as soon as he worked here. Whenever I needed a first edition of a novel for a friend as a gift, or I wanted a collection of stories, I wanted the best thing available, I talked to Ben McFall, and he never failed me. This is way before computer. Ben always remembered a request. When I came in the next time, he produced a book, or he'd say, well, not ready yet, will be. I love those kind of people. Ben never knew my name. And when I signed my first book contract, I said to him, I'm writing a book. And then I realized afterwards that he must hear that 3 or 4 times a day. This is Strand, after all. So he never bothered to know my name. It didn't matter. And I tore up that book contract. I had another book contract, and I tore that one up. I don't know that I bored Ben with all the details, but when I finally issued a card, official card, to show that the book was imminent, its release was imminent, he paid attention to my name. And I said to him I had a dream from the time I started shopping here. And one day, instead of buying books, I wanted to stand here and have people buy mine. So this is a dream come true, and I owe Ben a lot of thanks for that. We're going to look tonight at the life of Bud Powell, a life unprecedented in jazz history. He was born and raised in Harlem, and of the progenitors of modern jazz, sometimes referred to as bebop, a label that some rejected, he's the only one of the names we know to have been born and raised in Harlem. All the other innovators in that revolution of modern jazz came from somewhere else. There were, of course, the people we don't know about anymore. In every revolution, there are minor figures. They drift away from music. Something happens to them. We don't know who they are anymore. But of the ones we know, Bud Powell stands out in that regard as the only Harlem-born and raised innovator in the revolution that started to take place around 1938 or 39 in Harlem. But that's not why I say this is an unprecedented life in jazz history. I say it because of the circumstances, the forces, the social forces that acted on Bud Powell, much of which he had no control over, which he could do nothing about. Perhaps some things he could have done differently. But it is the conditions under which he worked and the things that happened to him that make it an unprecedented life. And when you consider that jazz is a music that grows out of an interplay of the group, all jazz emerges from group interplay, some of it planned and written down, some of it improvised. When you consider that, nonetheless, there have been these unique individuals throughout jazz history. We don't know who came before Buddy Bolden. There must have been somebody. But after him, you can start with Jelly Roll Morton, of course, Louis Armstrong, and then Coleman Hawkins, Billie Holiday, Lester Young, on to Charlie Parker. I'm leaving out, of course, many remarkable individuals. John Coltrane, Ornette Coleman, Cecil Taylor. Each one of these is unique. We will never see the like of any of them again. But when I say that Bud Powell's life is unprecedented, I think that's saying something, given all these other great geniuses. Of course, I'm not saying he wasn't a genius, but I am saying that my book focuses on the social and political issues as they impacted on him, making for this life that was unique. Before we begin, there's a few people in the audience I'd like to introduce. And they've had a great role in helping to see this book through to its completion in one way or another. The first amongst them is the man who was director, Institute of Jazz Studies, for more than 30 years. He's a multiple Grammy Award winner. He's written probably 1,000 liner notes. I consider him a friend as well, and he's helped me in innumerable ways, Dan Morgenstern. I now want to cite a few people who are a little closer to me, whom I might be able to get away with calling colleagues. First, a man who is the embodiment of Blue Note Records, the classic label. He became Blue Note Records in a way after its founders passed away. He's probably best known today for founding Mosaic Records, that catalog of classic jazz. And his involvement with jazz, I believe, goes back to age 16 when he went to Birdland. I don't know how he got in, but he did. Michael Kaskuna. Even closer to me in age. He was Associate Director, Institute of Jazz Studies, for more than 30 years. He's the author of Benny Carter, A Life in American Music, and he's a great photographer, Ed Berger. Also close to me in age, I believe, a man who has become a confidant only in the last couple of years. I've known him for many years, and he's helped me with marketing, publicity. He's always talking strategy. He's the author of Jazz Beyond Jazz and Future Jazz, and he's been president for more than 10 years of Jazz Journalists Association, Howard Mandel. And then there's the gentleman I worked for at Verve Records for many years. He's gone on to a career with Deutsche Grammophon and many other things, I'm sure. I owe him it's to him that I owe the genesis of the Bud Powell project, because it started with the box set. That's Michael Lang. As for the rest of you, I will not embarrass any of you. There are some dear old friends I haven't seen in years, and there are dear old friends I have. There are colleagues, old and new. I thank you all for coming. I will cite only one person, that's my partner in all things, and it's she without whom nothing is possible, Joan, my wife. The program is as follows. I'm going to listen to a piece of music. I'm sure I've had enough of all this. I'm going to give, and then I'm going to be interviewed. So, a piece of music, not yet. Then we're going to have an interview, and that means one more introduction. I'm very pleased that he's come from Philadelphia. He's a 5-time winner of the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award, which is given yearly to the best book in music. I think he's the best prose stylist writing on jazz. He may be the best prose stylist who writes on the arts. He's the author most recently of a Francis Davis Reader, Jazz and Its Discontents. I guess that means it's Francis Davis is here.
First, let me explain that I'm going to be unusually unopinionated tonight. I'm here as your surrogate, and even so, I'm sure there are questions that you will want to ask Peter that we won't get to. So there will be a Q&A and room for comments afterwards. But I wanted to ask you about that piece is Tempus Fugit. Yeah, I was going to ask you for the backstory. Yeah.
The backstory.
Yeah. What was going on in Bud's life? What was going on in jazz?
The date of the recording, February 23rd, 1949, may appear to be a bit of trivia, but in fact, the date was never known. In the various issues of this music, it's been said it was January 49, spring 49, May, nobody knew. And considering that jazz has, over the decades, found many able discographers, it's rather remarkable that the date was never known. The backstory is as follows. On the morning of this recording, Bud Powell was in a psychiatric hospital, Creedmoor, part of the state system run out of Albany. At the time, it was known as Department of Mental Hygiene. Today, it's known as Office of Mental Health. He was in Creedmoor and had been for most of the previous 15 months. He was given a minder. He was brought across the river from Queens to do the session. When the session was over, he was taken back to the hospital. He remained there for a couple of more months, which means that this happened in the midst of an 18-month confinement, during which he was subjected to insulin shock therapy and electroconvulsive therapy. That's remarkable enough. But when you consider what was going on in jazz in 1949, that Powell was confined at just the moment when the kind of music that he and his cohorts were promulgating and putting forward in the clubs, this had to be the most frustrating thing imaginable, considering that he had been preparing for this for years. And in a psychiatric report, which I petitioned Albany to get. I had to bring a case. In fact, I brought the case against Elliot Spitzer. He was governor at the time. No, blew it. See, I knew I'd blow that one. He was Attorney General at the time. Thank you, John. So I brought it's a formality, and I won the case. But the psychiatrist wrote in a report, in a shorthand, pleads as he speaks. This is his report after having seen Powell, the patient. Pleads as he speaks, as if he fears he will lose the place that he has attained in music. That is, if we don't let him out to do the session. Now, I find that remarkable because the psychiatrist had to go through rigorous training, medical school, internship, residency, all that. It's hard to believe that he didn't appreciate the pressures that he had gone through to become a professional, and that he couldn't translate that to a musician's world, that a musician too apprentices for years, does a residency, or if he can get one at a club, and then all that requires the kind of resolve that he required to get his medical degree. Nonetheless, he seemed surprised that Powell was anxious and determined to do the date. A few other facts about the date, and then we'll carry on with the interview. Its tune is called Tempus Fugit. And indeed, time was flying. Powell felt it was passing him by, hence this psychiatric interview where he told the psychiatrist, however he expressed it, I gotta do this date, I gotta get out, you gotta let me do it. The hospital had other ideas though. It knew that Powell was talented. They had given him some opportunities to play the piano. I don't know what the regimen was, once a week, twice a week, as part of his therapy. They let him play the piano. But the hospital had another idea. It had an annual fundraiser. Every March, Creedmoor invited local politicians, the press, and other people from the surrounding community. It was their outreach. It was their way of saying to the people around them, we don't torture people in here. We're not barbarians. We may give insulin shock therapy, which, by the way, at that point was already on its way out as an acceptable treatment, but Creedmoor continued to do it. We're good people, and we care for our patients, and we're looking after them. So the fundraiser was an entertainment, and it was called, and this is in the psychiatric literature, minstrel show. Both words capital. Capital M, capital S, minstrel show. I've seen photographs. There were people in blackface. This is 1949, New York City. There is no photo of Powell that I was able to find. Let's hope that they did not subject him to that. So they had their annual fundraiser, and they had this man who was rather talented on piano. And whether he played Indiana or, I don't know, some standard or other, he must have played pretty well. The strategy the hospital had, and I'll wrap up, Francis, is that at the end of the minstrel show, they announced the patients whom they deemed well enough to be released. In Powell's case, they held up the release so that he would play for the show. They wanted a good performance. They wanted a good entertainment. Powell gave it to them, I'm sure. So they held up his release and then announced at the end, I'll do my Lenny Bruce, you've been such a good audience tonight. I mean, however the guy did it, and I happen to know, I learned the names of the officials, of people at the hospital, and what their roles were. Most of them were dead, I didn't get to interview them. But they announced the people that they felt were healthy enough to be released. So Powell's release happened a couple of months after, 6 weeks after that. The final irony of it, of course, is that in researching this book, I came across many examples of the mental health system treating my subject rather shabbily at best. And yet, when I think about it today, if it weren't for my book, the names of those psychiatrists would be lost to history, and perhaps they should be. The officials at the hospital, well, if you ever, I read all the annual reports, the Creedmoor annual reports, they sit in Albany at the State Library. I mean, aside from that, those people are not known today. But this music is immortal. So to me, Bud Powell got even, or even more, because this music will live as long as there's music, and the people who had him appear in minstrel show were pretty much unknown.
That's where Powell was. What was going on in particular in jazz in 1949 that lent urgency to Bud Powell's desire, his determination that he had to record, he had to make this date?
He had only one opportunity to record previously on a major record date, and that was for Charlie Parker. Parker's genius, I think, was recognized as well as Powell's, but Parker had some personality, some ability to talk to record company people. And with 1945, there was a flowering of small labels. It was the small independent labels. Some of them started by an individual who just happened to love jazz, maybe had enough money to do so. But these independent labels were willing to take a chance on the new music, on modern jazz, in a way that the majors weren't. So people like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie knew enough, they had enough savvy for dealing with business people to get record dates. And from 1945, this music, which eventually the label Bebop stuck, whether you like the label or not, they were getting along. Powell saw this, and he saw that he was being left behind.
Being left out,
Yeah.
right, yeah. Mhm,
Yeah, and we have all the classic record dates of starting in 45 at the Savoy label, 46. As you know, there was a recording ban in 48. But by 49, and I've had eyewitnesses who were on the scene, and they said modern jazz was, well, everything was all over 52nd Street. You could still see the Kansas City guys. You could still see the New Orleanians, but there was plenty of modern jazz on 52nd Street and environs in 1949. Powell was left out.
But at that point, modern jazz, or what people call bop, was also, I get the feeling, kind of a youth music. Now, I don't mean that in the way it means today, you know, that it would be meant today, where you have all these songs that talk about we'll be young forever, you know, Katy Perry and things like that, where it's calculated to appeal to youth. It's just that the musicians were young, and the audiences, the followers, the camp followers, were young. And I think you hear it even in the tempos of something like Tempus, Fugit, or the piece Bud's Bubble, things like that, or his version of T for Two. There's a kind of speed to it that, as you get older, you associate with youth. And, you know, I mean, it's funny, I was listening to another pianist play Bud Powell's piece, Bud's Bubble, and he wasn't playing it at the right tempo. He was playing it at a tempo slower than Bud's. And it sounded like a different piece. The speed is so much part of it, you know, because otherwise it just sounds sort of, well, catchy and a little twee, and, you know.
I think there was a reaction amongst older people that this music was desperate. There was something desperate about the personalities of the individuals, and that probably worked against them. And I think it was Dizzy Gillespie more than anybody who, because of his humor and his ability to, I mean, the photographs of the era, and he's sitting with people at the tables, he's clowning around. Ava Gardner turned up at a club, he clowned around with her. He was able to bridge the gap that some of the others couldn't. Of course, many of them had addiction issues, and so that made them somewhat antisocial. But there was a reaction, by and large, from older people that this music was just overheated. There was a critical term I remember reading in Downbeat somewhere of the time, overheated music. It's just a bunch of, they're hysterical. It must be at the wrong speed. This sounds like 78, you know, that kind of thing. And I think that the speed issue from the inside, because of the music having incubated in Harlem, some of that was a test. The musicians wanted to test, if you're good, you'll be able to keep up with this tempo. And if you're not, get the hell off the stand. And that was happening in informal clubs as well as the larger establishments in Harlem. By the time they came to 52nd Street, the routines were worked out. So they could turn on a dime, they could turn around and all of a sudden quote from a standard piece, but those tempos were normal to them.
Yeah.
Because they came out of a breeding ground where if you can't keep up, let the next, because the saxophonists used to line up in Harlem at the clubs to get a chance to solo. You can't do it, get off the stage, next guy, come on.
Yeah, I mean, the tempo is hectic, but the whole thing is not to sound hurried playing it.
Good, yeah.
But, you know, when we were all learning our jazz catechism, like people around our age, I'm slightly older than you, but what we heard was that Bud Powell had translated Charlie Parker to the piano in the same way, like J.J. Johnson translated Charlie Parker to trombone. And when I first heard Bud Powell, that struck me as like very, very overstated and simplistic. Because for one thing, Powell, despite the horn-like attack and the phrasing and everything, is very pianistic, right? I mean, you know, and so who were some of his piano forebears?
Bach,
Yeah.
Chopin.
Well, Tatum also. Tatum,
Who?
people like that. Art Tatum. Art
Powell,
Tatum, yeah.
Powell was
Yeah.
studying the classics from age 5. His
Yeah.
first teacher was his father, and then the father recognized that he had tried to teach the older son piano. He didn't. The older son, William Powell Jr., didn't stick with it. Bud did. And so by age 5, possibly 6, he got him a classical instructor, a West Indian man named Rawlins. I guess his is a name that might have vanished with time, but I hope I can keep it alive anyway. And he schooled Powell in a very particular technique. He called it drop touch. I won't go into it, but he had a particular way of teaching the classics. So Powell learned classical technique, and he probably could have passed muster at competitions in his early teens. But by his middle or late teens, Thelonius Monk came into his life, and his father went out of his life. I don't, as a biographer, one is a little leery of making too pat an association there. But when Monk came into his life, some of his classical techniques suffered. But he still had that technique, and that had nothing to do with Charlie Parker.
No, it's also worth pointing out that his father, who you mentioned, was also a pianist, but Stride, right? I mean,
Stride was, well,
yeah, he
again,
wasn't a classical pianist.
It's a label. The father, I doubt, had any. His father's from Richmond, Virginia, probably did not have any formal instruction, but he was good, and he was considered a very good amateur.
Well, as you've indicated, Bud Powell was a child prodigy. Or I guess that's a redundancy. I don't know what other kind of prodigy there is, but he was a prodigy. And from a very young age, he was playing, I don't know if you consider it professionally, but he was playing rent parties and the like. Michael Kimmelman, who writes for the New York Times, used to be my colleague at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and at that time, I don't think he ever completed this, he was writing a book about prodigies. And Michael defined a prodigy, not just musical prodigies, chess prodigies and the like. He defined a prodigy as a child who does one thing at an adult level. And reading something, you paraphrase one of Bud's psychiatrists who writes that this is when Bud Powell is declared mentally incompetent in 1953, following his release from Creedmoor. I have to read this because I want to get the phrasing right. According to Oscar Goodstein, his manager, who was also appointed in effect his guardian or keeper, paraphrasing Powell's doctors, Goodstein said, and you paraphrase him, the only thing Powell had the mental capacity for was playing the piano. Well, he had been a prodigy. He had done that at an adult level as a child. And by the same token, I mean, autism is frequently somebody is extremely gifted in one area and not in anything else, really, especially in terms of social skills. But I'm wondering if Bud's precocity as a pianist disguised what were already signs of personality disorder when he was a child, or at least a lack of social skills, or a lack of learning social skills.
I'm more comfortable with the latter than the former. One of the nicest comments I've gotten from a reader was that I avoid psychiatric labels throughout the book. I'm very happy to put them in the words of the psychiatrist.
So you're more comfortable with prodigy than autism.
Yeah.
I wasn't suggesting. I know somebody who thinks that Bud was autistic.
Well, I know. I'm saying that
I'm not.
the only time I use the labels is when I put them in the words of the psychiatrist, and I mostly did that to show what I think was one of the real problems of the mental health system of the time, that people relied on labels because no two psychiatrists seemed to use the labels the same way, and each time he was diagnosed, it was with a different label. And some use antiquated labels, some use more recent labels of the time. I'm more comfortable with the idea that he lacks social skills because that I have some evidence for. It's not too hard to imagine somebody whose parents are showing him off, as you alluded to. He was playing in informal situations in Harlem from about age 10. There's no documentation of it. I tried. I could not get a discography for the informal parties he played at. But he was, from age 10, appearing in public. He was still in short pants, and his parents pushed him. And they pushed and pushed and said, look, this boy's amazing. The earliest things he did, by the way, he could imitate Fats Waller, and he could imitate James P. Johnson. And the first piece he learned was Carolina Shout, Johnson's finger buster, if ever there was one. But Tatum came later, because Tatum wasn't much in New York until later. But it was the fact that he was put on stage and in these parties, and people were drunk, and people were encouraging him, and oh my God, look at this kid, and all you parents out there who put your kids on stage or promoted your kids too much, there's a downside to it. He never learned how to behave with kids his own age.
Well, yeah, what else do you mean by social skills, though, that he lacked? In terms of communication with people?
Well, I think he learned certain adult gestures as a kid. I posit, mostly from Willie Lyon Smith's autobiography or memoir, which was very helpful to me. Smith talks about the rent parties in detail. I recommend it to anybody who wants a picture of Harlem in the 30s, particularly this entertainment milieu. And Smith says that even, no matter who you were, young, old, whatever, if you were at the piano, you were to entertain requests. You were there to swap jokes with in between numbers. You were plied with drinks. You were different from everybody else. If you didn't want to mingle with the people at the party, you could always sidle up to the pianist. After all, he's the performer. So I think that Powell had people coming up to him and, kidding around. He's 10 years old, 12 years old, and they're giving him liquor. Or they said, hey kid, you want a cigarette or something. And I think that he learned certain gestures or certain expressions that sounded adult, but he didn't really understand. So I think he sort of missed years of development.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I'm also wondering if, likewise, at least early on, some of his problems were overlooked or minimalized by fellow musicians because, they and he were inhabiting a subculture where erratic behavior was taken for granted and in some ways even prized. You point out that Monk used at least once, probably more, told people that he had taught Bud to act crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I tried to be very careful where I repeated things that had been in other books, because I'm very skeptical. At the risk of being labeled pedantic, my book has 850 endnotes. I tried to cite everything, every fact, because I didn't want somebody to come up to me and saying, how do you know that? So these quotes, and that the one you've just said, Monk saying, I taught him to act that way, I got from someplace else. I do cite it. I don't know that it's true. Right. Nor do I know that Charlie Parker was asked, and he said somebody saw Powell acting strange, so Parker said, oh, come on, you kidding? It's just an act. We all do that, or something like that. I don't know that these things were actually said. I do know that there was a lot of strange behavior, and your point is well taken, that some of it was chalked up to the fact that they were African American. Yeah. Some of it was chalked up to the fact that they were performers. Some of it, and the worst of it, in a way, was chalked up to the fact that they were doing something different. This was experimental music. And today, there are artists out there, we all know, who are doing something different, and it is very hard for the mass media to come to terms with it. So you put a label on it, or you say the guy's crazy, or something like that. That hasn't changed.
Well, some of it was seen as a put-on, too. Yeah. I mean, it's really ironic that the character was probably most sane or professional in terms of his relationship with the audience and so on, was nicknamed Dizzy. Yeah. I mean, he was the one who was putting it on in a way. But what was, you mentioned a different diagnosis every time. What were the diagnoses?
Dementia precox.
Which is what? I know we have a lot of mental health professionals here, but we have a lot of jazz people who don't know what precox means. So anyway, okay.
Well, I mean,
including me. Okay.
Many of the diagnoses would fall under the general category of some form of manic depression or schizophrenia. There are people even today who think that, well, if you have a mental problem, you're either in some form of manic depression or schizophrenia, whereas there are more enlightened people, I think, who allow for many other labels or diagnoses, and that these things change over time. So I think that it was a way of just writing him off to say, and in order to prescribe the drugs, was to say that he was some form of manic depressive or some form of psychotic or schizophrenic. But some of the doctors use the antiquated terms. I'm forgetting the term, the older term. term for it now. But
Antiquated in 49?
it depended who the doctor was.
Okay,
the same way some doctors prescribed electroconvulsive and some insulin shock. I don't want to go too much longer on the psychiatric.
No, but I just wanted to ask you, like heroes and villains float through the narrative.
Yeah.
I mean, so the heroes include Johnny Griffin, who's, was very close to Bud and took care of him. Alfred Lyon of Blue Note Records. Some of the women with whom Bud had very, almost like platonic, but almost like pre-adolescent, sort of let's hold hands kind of relationships. But there were villains too, and I just want to throw two names out and see if you think that they were villains or if it's more ambiguous than that. One is Oscar Goodstein. Explain who he was. And
Goodstein had absolutely no experience in jazz or in anything to do with the arts. He was an oil burner salesman who, that's funny, doesn't it? Considering the context here is bebop and all that, oil burner salesman. Well, somebody's got to sell those things. Well, he was an oil burner salesman who one night walked into Birdland, I do not know why, in 1950. And he encountered a world that just seemed completely alien to him, but did not turn him off. Now, I don't know if he just didn't want to go home or something, because Birdland didn't get going till 9:30 at night and went till 3 in the morning. So he got curious and he chatted up whomever was running the joint at the time. And when it was learned that he liked being up at night and was looking for a job, he was given the job to run the club. No experience in music or anything like that. The first artist he took an interest in was Bud Powell. There was something childlike about Powell that appealed to him. There was something so strange about him. And he admitted he did not understand what Powell was doing musically. He says, I never hear the melody. I don't know what he's doing, but he's a genius. So I think he was turned on by an entry into a completely alien world in which Powell was the manifestation of everything strange to him, including this avant-garde music and this remarkable technique.
But he also realized he could make money from Bud Powell.
Indeed.
And he worked him like a plow horse at some periods. And he arranged a marriage for Bud Powell.
Yeah,
this is what I mean by villain.
Guilty.
To a woman named Audrey Hill.
That's right.
Just quickly, and you might not know the answer because we want to, but you really present strong evidence in the book that after a certain point, Bud was impotent. Unless I'm
I don't know.
reading between the lines things that aren't there between the lines.
Well,
But,
it's fair game to read it that way.
Okay.
I hope I didn't make too strong a statement because I don't know.
I have pages folded down. Okay, but let me throw out one other name too, Buttercup. Explain who she was. Another villain.
Let me preface this by saying I received a review recently which was very hard on me, and I have to plead guilty. I think the critic is right. I obviously identified in certain ways with my artist. I don't know any biographer who doesn't identify to some real extent.
It's like method acting,
Yeah.
It's sort of, I was going to, right, yeah.
So I did see him as far more sinned against than sinning. And I saw at every turn the people I interviewed, and I interviewed probably 300 formal interviews, 500 informal, anybody and everybody who had ever seen him play. And there are people here tonight, I think, who did see him play. I know there are. And anybody. And what I came away with was, if only things had been different, if only he'd found somebody willing to help him, to look after him, who could identify that he had never really grown up, who could identify that all the technique in the world was not a replacement for dealing with the world, coping with nightclub managers, not the most savory genus species. If only that it happened. And so in telling the story, I am guilty, I believe, of putting the blame on many, I don't think all, but many of the people in his life. Altivia Edwards, known as Buttercup, is someone I'd rather not talk about too much, other than to say she came into his life. It was probably the lowest moment. He had just been in jail. I don't want to go into the details of it. He needed someone to look after him. She needed something to do, someone to believe in. And she took up the cause of looking after him. She didn't do a very good job. As years went on, I think she became further frustrated. And let's just leave it at that.
Okay. Well, you read the book, you'll find out. But one quick thing, too. What part I think you've already alluded to this, but what part did race play in all this? I mean, if Bud Powell had been, say, like a white concert pianist, would he have been treated differently?
Oh boy. Nothing would have been the same because he grew up in an era in a segregated part of New York City. De facto, Harlem was where African Americans lived. Earlier it had not been. A lot of German Americans were living there, but I get into some of the sociology in the book. There were some very good histories of Harlem where you could look into this. But from the time of Powell's birth, in the midst of Harlem Renaissance, he was born actually right in the middle of it, late 1924, he was surrounded, he knew nothing but African American life. And so to posit what he would have been had he not been what he was is...
No. The sort of thing I mean, though, is when
he might have had
he
a
was
career as a
declared
concert.
mentally incompetent and put in the care of Oscar Goodstein, and who has him out playing everywhere and so on. It's hard to think that would have happened to a white concert pianist with,
Well,
with mental problems. But and also you mentioned nightclubs. Nightclub owners as being pretty, unsavory, though we all know some good ones, too. A nightclub is, Bud had drinking problems, too. A nightclub is not the best place to be if you have if you have alcohol issues. I mean, I remember Jim Hall told me years ago that he's a guitarist. One of the reasons that he took a job on, I believe it was the Merv Griffin show, was he was kicking booze, and he was afraid to go into nightclubs, and how was he going to earn a living? So I think that would have made a difference too.
Well, alcohol was the lingua franca. I mean, you bought a musician a drink, it made you feel good. You bought a musician a drink, you could talk to him. He couldn't turn away. You just bought him a drink. It was social intercourse. It was everything.
Right, but I come from an Irish culture where there are people who are drunks and there are people who are alcoholics, and there is a difference. Believe me. Okay. One question, then we'll go to the audience.
Make it a positive one, something.
Was there a point of no return in terms of Bud's playing? I mean, was there? He had, with a lot of artists, you can divide it between early, middle, and late. Yeah. Really, our sense of Bud Powell's greatness is based on a very short period of time. But was there a point where it just never came back to him?
Okay, good question. I'll try to make it a positive answer.
and I can think of a positive example myself, but okay. But yeah,
first of all, there are people in this audience who can speak eloquently to the idea of there being late and bad Lester Young or late and bad Billie Holiday, and I know who they are, and they'll stand up and saying that's ridiculous.
I know.
Or late Louis Armstrong.
Okay, right, yeah.
I believe the creative process is something that no psychiatrist, no biographer, no jazz historian, or any group thereof can ever define. Therefore, the creative urge and the creative instinct never left Bud Powell any more than it did Billie Holiday, Lester Young, or Charlie Parker. Obviously, the frequency of successful tunes, sets, or nights decreased as he got older. But as late as 1962, there's a recording he did in Denmark. He loved playing in Denmark. He loved being there. He was treated with respect, as he was throughout Europe. He was there for 5.5 years. I couldn't get into any of the biography, obviously. And he's playing is beautiful. And as late 62, there's still a couple of places. So the frequency declines, but that urge, that determination to get up there and play, and then the release of whatever is in the mind that's creative and the transfers to the fingers, I don't believe leaves one as quickly or as completely as the books would have us believe. And in Powell's case, there's still good playing.
Yeah, and of course it's always subjective too, because there's one performance that we disagree on very much from 1957, a version of Like Someone in Love with George Duvivier and Art Taylor, which I think is just perfect.
All right.
Yeah, and you don't. Okay, so the point is...
Do you want Q&A now?
Yeah, let's do the Q&A.
Let's open it up.
Yeah. Howard.
Well, on a positive note, could you talk about any of Bud's experiences where he himself manifests satisfaction with what he did or pride?
Considering there are probably no more than 100 words in the book that are of him speaking, and I was very careful where I could count on the person telling me what he said. I put it in quotes. Actually, I put it in an extra set of quote marks to say he didn't, because many people talk to me. I know no one else does that, but I wanted to be very careful. So where I was confident that what I heard from my informant was what he said, considering there's only about 100 such words, there aren't quotes I can give you, but I can tell you that the Powell that has been described here tonight, with all his attendant problems and all the barriers to him playing, is not the Powell that musicians knew. And I'll be more specific. He saved his best for the best musicians. He had a very high standard, and if he didn't like the people he was playing with, he wouldn't countenance them. He wouldn't talk to them off the bandstand, and he wouldn't tell them what he was going to play in the next set, let alone say, hey man, that was a good set. The proof that you as a musician had arrived in his mind, or in your mind if you're the musician, was that he would talk to you. And amongst those people, he did talk, and then he could talk, I believe, again, this is second, third hand, rapturously about music he liked, including his own. He did have a tremendous ego, and there are stories of Steve Lacy met up with him on a street corner in the Village, 1958, and took him back to his place. He didn't know what to do with him. So Powell said, play my records. So when he was comfortable, he wanted to hear his own music, and when he was with those few people who he thought were good enough to talk to, they had the feeling. Bud Powell was willing to talk about his music to me. But that's all I have. That's hearsay, it's secondhand. There's no surviving interview. Was one on tape, thanks to Dan and Ed in Institute of Jazz Studies. I was able to hear it. It's never been issued. With Willis Conover. It's dreadful. He doesn't say anything for 45 minutes. He just grunts. But other than that, there's nothing. There are no words. But in the company of the few people, and many of them I couldn't get to because they were dead, he did talk, and they knew that he loved some of his playing and that he liked theirs. Anybody?
Hey, Peter.
Michael.
You know, basically, when you think of Bud Powell's life, he was one of those guys. I only saw him a couple of times. He was one of those guys I never could walk up to. He had an aura that you wanted to get out of the room as quickly as possible. Not when he's playing, but
Yeah.
But basically, his life is like a lot of mental health bureaucrats, a lot of users who took advantage of him,
Yeah.
and a lot of enablers like Francis. And an enabler can be just as destructive as a user.
Francis Podras, the Frenchman who looked after Bud Powell in Paris, and the subject of the film Round Midnight, the 1986 France-US co-production.
So who were the people that were positive in his life that made him feel loved, made him feel like a human being? Because all we hear about is different grades of nightmares.
At the risk of embarrassing her, there's a woman here tonight who did what she could. Her name is Dee Dee Emerson. She's back there. And Dee Dee was very kind to give me access to her diaries. And Dee Dee Emerson, in her way, did what she could. She told me tonight, boy, I was naive back then. And I said, I'm glad you were. I think it took a combination of naivete, passion for the music, patience, and something of a, I don't know, Red Cross mentality to want to help somebody who clearly had social problems. And there were others. Dee Dee is not the only one. I interviewed them. More of them are in Europe. His life in Europe was very different. The jazz community more closely knit, at least to me it seemed that way. New York's so spread out, we're all so busy. They don't have time for anybody. There they had time for him. And there were a number of people who told me, sometimes it was just a story. Oh yeah, well, I brought him back to my house one day. Oh, he was just so much fun. Of course he was fun because he played the piano. Everywhere he went, play, Bud, play. Go ahead and play. He was a music machine. But I think there were, here and there, mostly women, who, as you said, were willing just to hold his hand because that's all he wanted. And that was enough. I had a French woman tell me, we just held hands the whole night. And then she had a great quote. She said, people came up to him, and of course, he didn't want to talk about music, not to the average Joe. And everybody wanted to know how he did it, as if it was something he could tell in a sentence or two, how he, 15 years of instruction, that's how you do it. But he didn't want to answer. And then when they left him frustrated, because all he did was mumble or maybe some expletive to get out of there, he turned to her and he said, people think I'm stupid. I'm not stupid. What he's saying is, I don't care for chit-chat. The women who understood that and were just willing to hold his hand and not hear a word from him was enough.
Somebody Michael would be familiar with, who you mentioned like that, would be Randy Holten.
Randy Hultin.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Randy Hultin is a remarkable story to herself, a Norwegian woman, kind of the Norwegian equivalent of the Baroness for those jazz fans who know who that was.
But herself a writer, too. I mean, she...
Sort of. She never quit her day job. Okay. She worked for Norsk Hydro, which was a power company in Oslo. That was her day job.
The ovens and power companies were figure into the story.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about Bud's relationship with his brother Richie and possible influence on him?
Oh, wow. Thank you. Very good question. Richie was 7 years younger. So he didn't take to music at as young an age, and considering the father had left the family, I mean, he remained in the neighborhood, but he took off with a young woman, leaving the mother with the 3 boys. And so he didn't have the father's tutelage, at least not on a regular basis. Richie picked up music from the community, from people he hung out with. Jackie McLean was a dear friend of Richie's from a very early age. And then he started to take instruction with a guy named Bob Bunyan, who's something of a footnote to jazz history, but McLean mentioned him to me, as have others. Again, there's this, Dan Morgenstern has said many times, there's all the stuff that none of us historians know about, all these musicians and all these informal sessions and all the stuff that went on that has escaped history. So Richie was picking up and then taking lessons from people whose names we don't know anymore. And as he started to get good, so to speak, he asked Jackie McLean that he not tell Bud. So he didn't feel he would get encouragement from his brother. Of course, for those who don't know, Richie went on to a career which in some ways was more successful than Bud, because Richie was the pianist in what was probably the hottest band, I mean, the most in-demand band for a 2-year period, 1954, 1956, Clifford Brown, Max Roach Quintet. An incredible group. Richie was its pianist. So he was getting nightclub gigs all over the East Coast, the West Coast, great record sessions. They all survive on they're considered classics today. So Richie, at his peak, reached a level of success that Bud didn't, in part because Bud couldn't stick with the same group, and in part because Bud was in and out of hospitals.
I read somewhere that Richie took drum lessons, quit piano and took drum lessons with Max Roach for a while, and then Max Roach basically told him to go back to the piano.
Probably true. Roach had nothing but kind things to say about Richie, and Roach, whether it's true or not, took credit for encouraging Richie to write. And I think Roach used the psychology that, well, your brother, I mean, look at him, he's a genius, and he's written these great tunes, but you could write tunes too. And Richie does have a small songbook. There's a few tunes of theirs that Brown Roach did on record. So Roach told me, well, I pushed Richie in that direction, and I used the brother as a kind of, well, he did it, you could do it too. So. Yeah. Oh no, he had real talent too.
Richie arranged some of the standards also that group performed.
Yeah,
right,
I'm sure he did. Yeah. Do we have, how are we doing?
I think we have time for one more question.
One more? Would you like to introduce yourself? No. Okay.
What I was going to ask is, I know that Bud's mother asked Jackie McLean to bring Bud to various jobs around the city. What was the relationship between Bud and Jackie?
Jackie, when I think about Jackie McLean and the time that I talked to him, I could cry. Jackie was somebody who was so emotional when he talked and he reminisced that he made you, as I said, he made me want to cry. He loved Powell as I think he loved no other musician. I think it's a testament to how much this music got into the blood of these people, and to people in this room who have made their lives mission to promote this music and write about it and put on festival. I mean, there are people here who've consulted on every form of jazz, not just writing, because they realize how special this is. Powell's genius had gotten into Jackie McLean so deeply that he wanted to do anything he could for him. But he recognized that he, too, was 7 years younger than Powell. Although Jackie McLean's birth year keeps going back and forth between 1931 and 1932. I forget where I landed on it. But he was much younger. So he didn't feel he had the right to tell Powell what to do. And yet, he recognized that if he could just keep him from drinking so much, he was doing jazz a service. So he did take him to and from gigs, and Powell's mother said to him, "You make sure that Bud doesn't drink. I don't want him going to any bars. You take him to Royal Roost for his gig, and you bring him back." That's Midtown, 48th, and then bring him back. So he did. But the relationship was, as he told me, I loved him. I loved his music so. And amongst these musicians, and especially those who were on the cusp of this new thing, this whole new way of playing jazz, that was everything. What your private life entailed and what problems you may have had, I mean, these guys didn't pay attention to that. If you could play, you were in. And in this case, Jackie McLean loved Bud Powell. He loved him, as he maybe loved nobody else. He didn't care. I mean, he tried to take care of him a little bit, but by and large, the love that I heard in these musicians' voices for their mentors and their betters was such that the other stuff, the stuff that interested me in writing a sort of social and psychiatric history of this guy, it didn't interest them. I mean, they thought I was nuts. What do you want to, who cares? The guy could play. I didn't care about anything else.
Thank you all for coming out. Thanks for speaking. And Peter will be signing books later. Thank you.